When did making adults mad become a crime? Not too long after I assumed the juvenile court bench in 1999, I had what I call an emotional pause. You know, when you experience something or you hear something that shocks your conscience, it overwhelms your senses, seeming like life has come to a standstill. And then as the surreal begins to transform back into reality, the questions begin to form like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? How did we get to this place in the road? Well, for me, that moment occurred when my IT folks handed me some data that confirmed my anecdotal fears. And that was that my court was complicit in helping the police and the school system criminalize normal teenage behavior. Now, I knew from day one, I saw, that what looked like an extraordinary number of kids in front of me charged with minor school offenses. But before I went running off to the school system and the police to complain, I went to my IT folks and I said, look, can you break these numbers down for me? I need to confirm whether or not what I'm seeing is indeed reality. And they did. And what they handed me shocked me so much it put me into that emotional pause. And this is what the data said. Number one, that 1/3 of all the filings, delinquent filings, in my court came from the school system. The school system was by far the largest feeder of delinquent cases in my court. The data also showed that since putting police on campus, that the number of kids arrested increased by 2,700%. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was that 92% of those filings involved typical, normal teenage behaviors. Okay, I mean, things that I did when I was a teenager, and I'm sure that most of you did as well. I mean, I disrupted the classroom from time to time, acting like a class clown, wadding up paper, throwing it across the classroom, thinking I was funny. I got into school fights, defending my sister, a couple friends who were being bullied. And on a serious note, I did something that caused the police and the fire department to come out to the school. Well, that's a story for another day, but here's the thing. None of those things landed me in front of a judge. None did. So what's important is that given the fact that the studies show that students who are arrested on campus are twice as likely to drop out of school, and if they appear in court, they're 4 times as likely to drop out of school, then it should not surprise you that our data revealed that as the arrests on campus increase, the graduation rates fell, and that by the year 2003, they fell to an all-time low of 58%. Look, how go the overuse of suspensions, expulsions, and arrests, so go graduation rates? I mean, who would ever think that keeping kids in school would increase graduation rates, right? You would think that this is not a novel concept in education. But the rest of the story is really what happened to the kids who got kicked out of school or dropped out. You see, there's a simple algorithm in the world of delinquency prevention. How go graduation rates, so go juvenile crime rates. That's why education to us folks in juvenile justice is so important. Who would have thought that the more kids we graduate, the fewer kids committing crimes? Now, this phenomena years ago came to be called the school to prison pipeline. The pipeline works like this. Zero tolerance policies push kids out of school into the streets and then into criminal activity. Now, this phenomena was happening, obviously, in my county. And my IT folks showed me a graph with a line that showed graduation rates that were dropping, okay, all right, while the juvenile crime rates were going up, forming an X, okay, on the graph. Now, when you get an X on the graph, that strongly suggests that there is a correlation between those variables, in this case, graduation rates and juvenile crime rates. But the truth in these numbers is that our school system's harsh disciplinary policies was contributing to the increase in our crime rates. Think about that paradox for a moment. Let me put it to you another way that I think might resonate better. Our school system whose mission it is, of course, is to improve the quality of life of its citizens, was implementing policies that victimize those citizens. Sadly, the kids that were affected the most were our kids of color. See, at the peak of our zero tolerance system, before we acted to dismantle it, a kid of color was 12 times more likely to be arrested on campus than his white peers, and for the same offense. The idea that zero tolerance policies is racial neutral, it's a myth. It's a lie. But I knew I had to do something about it. I mean, everyone was intersecting right there at the juvenile court. And so what I did is I gathered the chiefs of police, the school superintendent, social services, mental health. I called upon the local chapter of the NAACP to come to the table because they had to be there because it was the community of color that was getting hurt the most. And so what we did is we hammered out an agreement, took us 9 months, that said, these particular delinquent offenses, we're no longer going to arrest kids on this, and we're going to replace them with positive interventions. This agreement is called the School Justice Partnership, all right? And it was the first of its kind in this country. But within 6 months of implementing it, the number of school arrests fell by 54%. And today, the number of arrests are down 95%. And no, school safety hasn't been compromised. In fact, it's improved. And not only that, but so has the community at large, because the juvenile crime rate has fallen 80%. But most importantly is our felony filings, you know, the serious ones that involve guns and robberies and car thefts and burglaries. Well, they're down 64%. And why did this happen? Well, I'll repeat it again. How go graduation rates, so go crime rates. You see, when we got rid of those zero tolerance policies that were pushing kids out of school, our graduation rates began to climb. And between starting the School Justice Partnership to 2011, they increased by 24%. I say 2011 because that's when the Department of Education changed the reporting formula for graduation rates. But since 2011, our graduation rates have continued to climb, increasing another 23%. And you know who's benefiting from this? Our kids of color. Because today, you know, our kids of color are just as likely as a white kid to be arrested on campus, not 2 or 3 or whatever more times likely, just as likely. We have more kids of color graduating high school today and moving onward to a positive future and not a prison. You know, folks, I'm convinced that the most significant factor to prevent and reduce delinquency in any community is in how we treat our kids. It was Maslow who said, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And I have found throughout my 22 years on the juvenile court bench that what worked to turn kids around was what looks soft on crime, not what is considered tough on crime. Why is it that America incarcerates more children than any other country in the world? What is it about our culture that we see kids as nails and we go right for the hammer? And I'm not going to attempt to answer these questions. They're deep and complicated. But rest assured, we must change our culture by adopting practices that are empirically proven to work, even if they look soft on crime. We must pass laws and policies that are smart on crime, not practices that look tough for the sake of looking tough, and because they have no impact on crime. Look, if reducing school arrests by 95% leads to decreasing juvenile crime, how is that soft on crime? We need to reframe in this country what it means to be tough on crime by measuring what we do by its impact on crime. Does it create fewer victims? But I think the good news is that at least as far as school systems are concerned, the School Justice Partnership is making a difference, because this model has been replicated with similar outcomes in jurisdictions throughout about 41 states. In fact, the state of North Carolina just recently passed legislation mandating my School Justice Partnership model. So let me explain a little bit more as to how this works when it involves juveniles. You have to understand teenagers. First of all, it begins with their brains. The prefrontal lobe cortex, which is right there, okay, is what translates emotion into logic. It is what helps us to resolve conflict without resorting to physical altercations. But get this, it's not developed till age 25. This teen brain science is so powerful that it convinced the United States Supreme Court to abolish the death penalty in life without the possibility of parole for teenagers. You see, we cannot hold teenagers to the same standards as adults because they're neurologically wired to do stupid things, despite the fact that during the lifespan of a human, the time when our brains are functioning at its maximum intellectual capacity, which is during the teen years. Look, I point to Mark Zuckerberg, who by the age of 20 created Facebook, or in the brain of a 16-year-old were the first thoughts of the concept of the law of relativity, Albert Einstein. And I even point to Taylor Swift. Yes, Taylor Swift, who left home at age 14 to go to Nashville to start a music career. But despite their intelligence and their creativity, the three of them could not purchase alcohol until age 21. And that's because of the prefrontal cortex. So, normal teens are prone to risk-taking behaviors and making poor decisions. That's the bottom line. But what about those kids who live in poverty and struggle almost every day with home and food, clothing and other insecurities, and who witness family violence and violence in their neighborhoods? These are our children who suffer adverse childhood experiences, or also known as childhood trauma. While the vast majority of students in our system that were diverted away from arrest and they were placed in restorative practices and educational workshops, okay, there were still the 11% that reoffended. A small number, but still 11%. And we want to know why. So we asked the parents of these 11% if we could administer the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, which measures the level of childhood trauma in people. And we found that among the 11%, 86% of them suffered from serious childhood trauma. In other words, they needed more than just restorative practices and educational workshops. They needed clinical help. And so we didn't want to give up on them. And by 2010, we created a nonprofit that assessed and treated those 11%. So they too could graduate from high school. That system we called the system of care. And it represented a shift from targeted reactions to population-based prevention and intervention. In other words, it was a public health approach, specifically employing the epidemiology model, which, because there's two basic facts in the epidemiology approach. Number one, diseases don't occur by chance. And number two, they're not randomly distributed. Now, I'm not saying that disruptive behaviors and delinquent behaviors are diseases. Of course, they're not, but they do behave like diseases. Like diseases, delinquent behaviors and disruptive behaviors don't occur by chance. They're not randomly distributed, which means they can be studied to determine their underlying causation. Look, it was my father who retired from CDC many years ago. He worked in immunization. Once said to me, he said, "Son, the problem with you people in criminal justice is that you punish the symptom instead of treating the cause." You see, he explained to me that delinquent behaviors are a symptom of something affecting the child emotionally, mentally, environmentally, and other ways. He says, so long as you respond to the behaviors, which are mere symptoms, you will never reduce recidivism. And this conversation led me to reframe how we view juvenile delinquency and how to reconfigure our system to be smarter and how to approach our kids who find themselves in trouble. So in closing, I want to share this anecdotal story that really captures how we changed our system. Jane is 15 years old. She's sitting in school in class, and a boy, I'll call him Johnny, leans over and says to her what he wants to do to her sexually. Well, she gets upset, shouts at him. The teacher, Miss Jones, admonishes Jane. Well, she didn't hear what Johnny said, but Jane loses it and starts throwing chairs at her. The SRO, which is for school resource officer, that is a uniformed officer who's placed on campus, goes running in there and has to restrain Jane. Now, in the old days, before the partnership, she would have been placed in the back of a patrol car after being handcuffed and taken down to juvenile intake, likely would have detained her for aggravated assault on the teacher. But today, we don't. We've included a pause button. We ask why. Remember the epidemiology approach? Determining causation, behavior is the symptom, what caused the behavior? And after about an hour, by using crisis intervention skills that he's been trained in, Jane confided in the school resource officer that her mother's live-in boyfriend, Willie, was raping her every week. And worse yet, she told the mom, and the mom didn't believe her. Now you can understand in Jane's world now, when Johnny leaned over and said what he wanted to do to her sexually, given what's going on in her life every week. And you can understand why she lost it with the teacher. Not that it was the teacher's fault, but in Jane's world, there was not a single adult that was helping her. All she heard the teacher do was just admonish her. And that was enough to trigger somebody with trauma. But here's the rest of the story. Jane did not go to detention. She was placed in protective custody. Initially placed in foster care shortly after I placed with the maternal grandparents who did not like Willie, and I knew they could protect her. And guess what else? Willie gets arrested, and he's now in a state penitentiary serving 25 years for aggravated child molestation. I ask you, which system is truly tough on crime? Is it mine that looks soft, or the one that likes to punish the symptom really quick, where there's no time to hit the pause button and ask why? You see, folks, today we understand that when kids are hurting, their behavior becomes their language. Like Jane, they're talking to us adults. Don't you think it's time that we simply start listening? Thank you.